Hello, everybody. It is Monday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined by Ray Fittipaldo for the Monday episode of the North Shore Drive podcast. Christopher Carter's usually in this slot, Ray, but he is traveling back from Ireland, so we're giving him the day off. So you're stuck with me, folks, for today. We're going to be talking about the Steelers' big victory in Dublin. A lot of good things that we haven't seen from this team yet this season. How sustainable are they? Why did things work this week against the Vikings as opposed to the first 3 weeks of the season? We're also going to be talking about the upcoming bye week that the Steelers are facing. Does it end up being a good thing they're getting an early off week? What are the things that they should be working on? And what are we going to be watching around the division and around the AFC in terms of the Steelers standing there? Excited to dig into all of that. Just want to remind you, this show is presented by FanDuel. We also want to thank another sponsor, Edgar, Snyder & Associates. When you've been hurt on the job, who decides when you're better? Who decides when your treatment is over? Who decides when your benefits are over? The answer might surprise you. Insurance company doctors do. How does that make you feel? If the answer is not great, call Edgar, Snyder & Associates today at 1-800-94-EDGAR. They'll fight for the work comp rights you deserve. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, there were still some flaws for the Steelers in this big victory against the Vikings. They were outgained, allowed almost 400 yards of offense. Carson Wentz had 350 yards through the air. Take away the 80-yard pass to DK Metcalf for a touchdown, and the passing game still wasn't piling up huge numbers by any means. So it still felt like one of their more complete performances of the season because they were able to run the ball, they were able to stop the run, and they were able to sack the quarterback. Was this win bigger in terms of practical differences from the early part of the schedule, or is it maybe bigger psychologically because you saw the ball go through the hoop a little bit with some of those things that you've been struggling with?
Yeah, well, just think about what their identity is on offense and defense, or more like what they want it to be. And let's start first with the pressure and the sacks. We've seen that come to fruition the last 2 weeks. It was evident against the Patriots, and I thought that was their best game of the season, pressuring Carson Wentz yesterday. So that was good to see, and it took them 2 games, but it seems like their pressure package is in a really good spot right now. Now, the one thing that hasn't been consistent is the run defense and the run offense, but we saw some sparks in those areas as well yesterday. Kenneth Gainwell stepping in for Jaylen Warren, 99 yards. He also had, I think, 30 or so yards receiving out of the backfield. I thought he was really, really good. And, you could just watch his patience behind the line. It looked a little bit different than Jaylen Warren. I'm not saying it was better, but he was setting up his blocks. And I thought the big personnel with Darnell Washington and Spencer Anderson was really important in that game. That gave them a big boost. And, the run defense, Adam, first time they held an opponent under 100 yards this season. And I don't know what it looked like to you, but it just looked to me like the run game was never a factor for Minnesota. If they were going to beat the Steelers on Sunday, they were going to do it through the air. Now, they almost did, through the Steelers' own faults. They almost did, but the run game was not a factor, and that was good to see as well.
Yeah, I think they got off to a decent start with Jordan Mason, but it pretty much shut off from the maybe middle of the second quarter on, and that's a lot of time for the Steelers not to have to worry about that facet of the game. So yeah, it's one of those things where, Ray, sometimes I feel like the tone is set early in these games in terms of what you think is going well and what you think is going wrong, and they did give up some rushing yards to Jordan Mason there, but you look at the box score at the end, held under 60 yards, so that ends up being a great performance from this defense. I want to go with those good things we saw piece by piece a little bit. What was the running game doing well and differently, especially with a guy in Kenny Gainwell who's been kind of a punching bag for a lot of fans, I think, in the early going, wondering why he's getting carries. There's also people that just want to see more of the rookie Kaleb Johnson because they see him as the future of this backfield, but we end up getting a heavy dose of Kenny Gainwell instead. So what was working there that was different than the first handful of weeks, especially noticeably with Jaylen Warren out as a late scratch?
Yeah, I think the Steelers knew what they were getting in Kenneth Gainwell when they signed him as a free agent. He's a good outside zone runner. He knows how to run in that scheme. And what I mentioned before, just the ability to set up blocks, to see the holes develop. He was really good in that manner. And it's not a surprise for me that he was the bell cow yesterday. I think a lot of people just look at, okay, Kaleb Johnson was drafted in the 3rd round. He should have a bigger role now that Jaylen Warren is out. But if you were at training camp every day like I was and every beat reporter was, Adam, you saw that the Steelers had a lot of trust in Kenneth Gainwell. I talked about it throughout July and August that he was getting a lot of reps, and I could sort of see this coming from a mile away. And this not to downgrade Kaleb Johnson. I thought he was okay in his role on Sunday. I think he had 22 yards on 6 carries, ripped off a 9-yard run. So he was fine, but Kenneth Gainwell, they really like him. And if you look at it now, it's a really good signing. I think they got him on a 2-year deal. I think it was around $4 million. So they didn't pay a lot of money to get him, and it's turning out he's a pretty important piece for the Steelers offense.
Let's also get into the Jordan Mason component of it. I mentioned they kept him under 60 yards. Was it just the style of the Vikings running game that was a contrast from some of these other ones where you had the more mobile quarterbacks to worry about, and Justin Fields, Drake May a little bit? Did that allow the Steelers to sell out a little bit more? What was working for them in this game in stopping the run compared to the early part where that's been a huge struggle for this unit?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. They were okay early, but I think, and I'm not going to say this came back to bite the Vikings, but they were having so much success throwing the ball to Justin Jefferson early. I think they kind of fell in love with that. And, the Steelers secondary was getting banged up throughout the game. So I think Kevin O'Connell was looking at that and saying, okay, they're down this guy, they're down Jalen Ramsey, Darius Lay's out. All these guys were in and out of that football game, and they were already minus a starting corner in Joey Porter that I think Kevin O'Connell felt like, okay, this is where they're weak. This is where they have to attack them. So, the Steelers front did a really good job. I thought, TJ Watt and Nick Herbig played really well. I thought Peyton Wilson was better as a run defender yesterday. Everyone's going to talk about that play where he ran down Jordan Addison, and I feel like it was the play of the game. I thought it was one of the best plays I've ever seen from a Steelers defender during the regular season. But just taking on blocks in the hole, being more physical. I know Cole Holcomb played a little bit, but this was really a Peyton Wilson game. He had 13 tackles, Patrick Queen 11 tackles. It just seemed like everyone was on point in the running game yesterday, and I think it showed up in the final totals. Yes, they were a little bit leaky early, excuse me, but they took care of that as the game wore on.
Ray, let's talk about the pass rush. Was it a function of Carson Wentz being relatively immobile compared to Justin Fields, Drake May, maybe even Sam Darnold to some degree? Was it a matter of, Brian O'Neill, the great tackle for the Vikings, former pick guy, gets injured early on, so they didn't have him to deal with? Or do we see what happens when the defensive line, plays well instead of being a liability as it was, for the first handful of weeks? Keeanu Benton gets a sack. He's a guy that's been, in the crosshairs for a good chunk of the season, but I thought he had a very solid game on Sunday.
Yeah, and also they had Donovan Jackson, one of their starting guards, who also missed that game. So now I think O'Neill was hurt definitely in the first half, maybe even the first quarter. So you're down a starting tackle and you're down a starting guard, and the Steelers really took advantage of that. I thought their stunts were really good. They were well-timed on the Nick Herbig sack. I think Keeanu Benton might have got a half a sack on this one, but if you remember, Herbig looped around, came up through the middle, and I think Hayward had contained on the outside. Keeanu Benton had his gap. They were just working really well together, and you didn't always see that with the Steelers in the first couple games of the season. Sometimes they would get out of their gaps. For instance, last week, Drake May broke contain a couple of times, and he was able to run for first down. So just their gap integrity was really good with their pass rush. And listen, when you have TJ Watt and Nick Herbig singled up on tackles, you're going to win a lot in those situations as well. So yeah, Carson Wentz, I thought had a good game, but I thought the pressure really got to him as well. And I mentioned this on the post game with King yesterday. They got him on the ground 6 times for sacks. I don't know how many other hits they got him on him, but he came up holding his ribs A couple of times you could tell he was in pain. And then the one time Cam Hayward hit his arm, actually hit his fingers, and he was holding his fingers, his throwing hand on his throwing hand. So that affected him for that series as well. So even when they weren't getting sacks against them, they made him feel the pressure. And that was obviously a huge factor in this football game.
You worry at all about the 350 yards passing, right? Or do you just say, hey, that's how the game scripts go, when a team is behind 18 points like the Vikings were? Because I'll say this, it didn't feel like he threw for 350 yards to me.
No, I wish I looked this up before we came on. The totals definitely before the Addison catch. So there was like 7-8 minutes left, and they were down, 24-6 or whatever it was. And then they had the big comeback. And, Steelers played prevent a little bit. They didn't do a great job. If he threw for 250, probably 175 or 350, 175 or 200, I think, came in the final, the back half of that fourth quarter, like from the 7 or 8 minute on. So I thought a good job until then. And I mentioned the injuries in the back half. Mike Tomlin said it was the reason for that miscommunication. They were in big nickel, so they were playing 3 safeties, which isn't ideal. He said they were really limited from a schematic standpoint. They couldn't play man-to-man there. So that's all true, but also you can't get beat deep in that situation. You got to have somebody back. And obviously that miscommunication and the injuries played a big factor there. But, yeah, I thought overall, in my grades, I gave the secondary a C, probably just really more for that communication. But like I said, if you look at what happened for the first 3.5 quarters, actually, I thought it was pretty good until that point.
Right, we are going to talk about the Steelers' upcoming bye week. What are we watching with the team? What are we watching around the AFC and the AFC North division? So make sure you stick with us. We'll be right back. Back for the second segment here on the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm Adam Bittner in for Christopher Carter, joined by Ray Fittipaldo. We're talking about the Steelers' upcoming bye week after their big win in Ireland. What are we watching for this week? Before we get into all of that, we want to thank another couple of sponsors. Are you looking to diversify your playbook beyond the stock market? Right here in Pittsburgh's Shadyside neighborhood, Olivian Numismatic Rarities helps investors and collectors build wealth with rare coins, paper money, and precious metals. Whether you're stacking gold and silver, building a tangible asset portfolio, or selling an inherited collection, ONR brings integrity and expertise to every transaction. Stop by their premier gallery on 5833 Ellsworth Avenue in Shady.com or call 412-900-COIN today. That's 412-900-COIN today. We also want to thank Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci, Pittsburgh's mesothelioma and asbestos attorneys with over 85 years of experience. Call them for a consultation or visit sdklaw.com. Ray, what are the priorities for this team heading into the bye week off of this performance? Where do you see the biggest need for improvement or continued improvement, beginning with what we saw in that second half against the Vikings?
Well, 2 areas stick out to me, Adam. Number one, they got to get healthy. I mean, this is actually a great time for a bye. Players complain about it before the season starts, but you look at how banged up that secondary is right now, and with Calvin Austin going down, they really need to get healthy. And our Jerry Dulac reported late last night that it's going to be a couple of weeks for Calvin Austin and for Jalen Ramsey. So even with the bye, those guys are probably going to miss some time after it. So that's really important. And part of that is, and we just got into it in that last segment, is the communication issues on defense. They're still popping up. I think it's gotten better, but they're still popping up at inopportune times, and they really have to work to get that ironed out. I mean, Mike Tomlin has used the injuries as an excuse when talking about that, but really, if you're on the football team and you're asked to go into the game and play, you should be able to execute assignments without that much of a drop-off. And then if we could flip over to offense real quick, they kind of solved the DK Metcalf issue yesterday. His production through 3 games wasn't good. They got him on track yesterday. I don't know what's going on with the tight ends. I mean, Pat Freiermuth played like 13 or 15 snaps yesterday. didn't have a catch or a target. Darnell Washington led all tight ends with, I think, 20 receiving yards. He outsnapped Jonnu Smith and Freiermuth by, I think, like 30 snaps or so. So that was probably game specific. They probably wanted to play Washington because of the big personnel in that game. But you're paying Jonnu Smith and Pat Freiermuth, I think, a combined $20 million, maybe more than $20 million in 2025. You got to start to get more out of those guys. And I think that's obviously going to be a focus as well during the off week, especially if Calvin Austin is going to be out for some period of time.
Yeah, we talked in the first segment about how it didn't feel like Carson Wentz threw for 350. Also didn't feel like Aaron Rodgers threw for only 200, Ray, and a big chunk of that came on a single play to DK Metcalf. So and do you feel like the passing game is in an overall better place, or do you say that's one big play and still just not enough from those guys? And I think that particularly became true in the second half when they weren't able to kind of put that game away.
Yeah, and I give Arthur Smith and Mike Tomlin credit for getting DK going, but yeah, overall, if you want to look at it from a 4-game perspective, they haven't been good enough in the passing game. And Rodgers talked about it after the game yesterday. They got to be able to. The offense has to be able to put that game away. And we talked about it on the post-game show yesterday. That call on the goal line. They were really good in the first 3 weeks of scoring when they were in the red zone or goal to go situations. To me, put the ball in Aaron Rodgers' hands. I think it was 4th and 2. Gainwell got stopped on the 1 yard line. Why do a running play there? Put the ball in your best player's hands. Do an RPO. Have Rodgers do something there give him multiple options in the passing game. So that would be one way to solve it. Just give Aaron Rodgers more opportunities. But then again, Adam, you look at it, they're 3-1. Rodgers doesn't have great numbers, but he's really efficient. He's not really turning the ball over. I mean, other than the bad pick to open the second half against the Patriots, I really can't think of like many other bad mistakes that he's made, like maybe holding on to the ball a little bit, taking some sacks in the first 2 games. But overall, he's been really efficient. He's protected the football, and I think that's the reason the Steelers are 3-1 heading into the bye.
Yeah, and I think there's a function down at the goal line of they haven't been overcomplicating it. They've been going to Darnell Washington a fair amount. They've been going to DK Metcalf. Those guys that bring a lot of size and dimension down there. Yeah. It seems like they started to overthink it a little bit on Sunday. So we'll see how that continues to resolve. Ray, you mentioned a little bit earlier. Do you feel like this early bye ends up being beneficial to this team? Obviously, you're traveling back from Europe, so that's one facet of it. They do seem to need to get healthy in quite a number of spots. You had some of the pre-existing injuries, plus the ones you mentioned that they added to the pile on Sunday. And then it does feel like an opportunity to address some of those flaws instead of having them fester while you're already 3-1. You got 3 wins in the bank. Instead of having to address things on the fly, you kind of get a chance to reset early here, say, okay, we need to be a lot better here, here, and here. How can we use these 2 weeks to do that?
Yeah, and Mike Tomlin always says during the bye week, no matter when it comes, it can come in week 4, it can come in week 8 or week 12. There's 2 things he wants to get accomplished. Number one, he wants to get his younger players some work and practice, and we'll see if he does that this week. It sounded yesterday, if you listen to his postgame, that he wasn't going to work them a lot, but if he does, all the vets are going to sit out, and you'll see a lot of the young guys get some work, and that's his way to get those guys ready in case there's more injuries in the second half of the season. But really, the most important part of the bye week is just a lot of self-scouting. You look at what went right during the first 4 games, you look at what went wrong, and then you sit down as a staff and you try to figure out, okay, how can we fix this? How can we be better with our communication? How can we be better? How can we get our tight ends more involved? How can we have a more consistent running game? So all the topics that we touched on last segment, they're going to try to sit down and they're going to try to, to figure it out here over the next 7 days or so. And then, they'll get ready for that home game against the Browns at Acrisure on October 12th. So there's a lot to get accomplished. I'm sure Steelers fans are sitting here and looking at the standings. The Steelers are 3-1. The Ravens are 1-3. They got a 2-game lead on their chief rival in the AFC North, but there's a long season to go, and there's still a lot that this coaching staff has to iron out over the next week or so.
You set up my next question well, Ray. Steelers odds in the division keep creeping up, according to our friends at FanDuel. Ravens are still the favorite in the betting markets at minus 220, but the Steelers are up to plus 290 underdogs, which is a little worse than 2-1 odds, which compared to where they were, I think the odds were at 5-1 last week. So you've taken a big step. Do you look at what's going on with Baltimore as just a function of a brutal early schedule with the Bills, Lions, and Chiefs, or do you see maybe some flaws with them that perhaps the Steelers would have a chance to exploit, even though that they're going to have to face these same teams later in the season, except for, I think, the Chiefs?
Yeah, I mean, the Ravens definitely have some flaws. I mean, the least of which is their quarterback apparently has a hamstring injury that might keep him out, for a little while. So that's certainly something to watch, and we'll see if they could stop the bleeding. But their defense, Adam, they entered the week dead last in the NFL in yards and points allowed, and that's only going to get worse after that Chiefs game. So they got a lot of work to do, and I think they got 2 more games before their bye week. So they got to try to figure out a way to beat the Texans this week and, not, get behind the 8 ball even more. And the way I look at it from the Steelers' perspective, they're right where they have to be. We talked about it really since the schedule came out. Take advantage of the early soft schedule, be 4-0 or at the very least 3-1. That's where they are. And obviously you've got to get better and be playing your best football in the second half of the season when you get the Ravens twice, when you get the Lions, when you get the Bills. That's where we're really going to find out about this football team. But for the Steelers, they did their part. They're in very good position heading into the bye week, and we'll see how the dominoes fall here once they get going here in mid-October with the Browns coming in.
Also want to widen the aperture a little bit, Ray. The Chiefs also have the 2 early losses. Obviously looked pretty good yesterday, so maybe they're bouncing back to some degree. But I think the Bills are the only team that's kind of head and shoulders above the rest right now. You've got the Chargers at 3-1. I think the Colts at 3-1. So some teams at the top of the AFC standings that I don't think we expected to be there, or at least quite as high going into the season. Maybe that includes the Steelers for a lot of people around the NFL. So what teams, as we're sitting at home on Sunday and next weekend, and I guess even for Monday Night Football tonight, are you kind of keeping the closest eye on as teams that could potentially step into that AFC, co-favorite or division favorite that could play well in the playoffs and be a threat to make it to the Super Bowl?
Yeah, to me, it's the Bills. I picked the Bills to go to the Super Bowl before the season started. I'm not counting the Ravens out. The Ravens, even with their bad defense, I think if Jackson is healthy, they're going to be able to outscore some people, and I think they'll get back into the division race and really, give the Steelers a run for their money. So clearly, I think the Bills are number 1 right now. You mentioned it. The Chiefs are coming on. We'll see if they can figure it out. I don't think they're the team they were 3 and 4 years ago, but I still think they're a factor. But when you talk about a team that is looking to take advantage of a window, right? The Bills have been there. They just haven't been able to get past the Chiefs. If I'm the Buffalo Bills, I'm trying to get the number 1 seed, and I'm trying to do everything I can to avoid the Chiefs in the playoffs, just because they've kind of just been a thorn in their side over the years. It doesn't seem to matter if the Chiefs are playing well or whatever the circumstances are. The Chiefs just have their number in the playoffs. So for me, if I'm the Bills, just try to get to 14-3 or 15-2, whatever it is, get the 1 seed, and then have the home field advantage throughout the playoffs.
Is anyone else sticking out to you, Ray, so far?
Well, I mean, I like the Chargers. I like what they were doing. Then I thought they had a bad loss yesterday. The one team that surprises me, I guess maybe 2 teams, but, it's still early. I kind of want to see how they continue to develop. It's the Colts and the Jaguars. The Colts were in position to stay undefeated yesterday, if not for a bonehead play by one of their receivers. I think they might have done it yesterday. And the Jaguars seem like they're in a much better spot now with their new head coach. So those are 2 teams to keep an eye on. In the AFC South, it seems like the Texans are down a little bit, but maybe the Colts and the Jaguars are rising up, and maybe one of those 2 teams can surprise here in the second half of the season.
Yeah, I think that Texans-Ravens game is probably going to be the most interesting to me from a Steelers perspective of, I don't want to say it's a potential elimination game, but if you lose that game as the Ravens or the Texans, you're in a lot of trouble. So that'll be a fun one to keep an eye on. Ray, thanks for joining me this week. Everyone else, please stay tuned to the channel. Please subscribe if you haven't already. We're going to have a lot more coming your way. We're going to get our guys back across the pond here. We'll have some podcasts from them and their experience in Ireland. Ray and I were in Pittsburgh, so we don't have a ton to add there, but I'm sure we'll get some cool stories for what the guys were doing in Dublin. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that. And check out our written work at post-gazette.com. Ray mentioned his report card. I'll be doing my PFF grades at some point here. And, of course, we're going to have all the guys coming back from Ireland as well. So lots coming at you. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.